I had not expected the lamps to speak to me. That is the truth I must begin with, though it sounds like madness, even now, months later, when I can still see their cold electric glow behind my closed eyelids and feel the waltz spinning me toward ruin. The invitation had arrived on thick cream paper, the Duke of Ashford's crest pressed into black wax, and my mother had wept with relief when I showed it to her. A midnight ball to celebrate our engagement, he wrote in his precise, measured hand, and I was to wear white as befitted a bride, though we would not marry until spring. I remember holding that card and feeling nothing, which frightened me more than sorrow would have. I had learned to feel nothing in the year since they told me Thomas was dead, since the night I stood in the rain outside the cemetery and knew I would never again hear his voice or feel his hand warm against mine, or believe that love was anything but a cruelty practiced by fate upon the foolish. The Duke was not cruel. That was what everyone said, and it was true in the way that ice is not cruel, only cold. He was handsome, in a distant way, his features sharp and aristocratic, his manner impeccable, his wealth beyond imagining. He had chosen me, my mother said, because I was docile and well-bred and would not embarrass him, and because my family's old name still meant something, even though our fortune had long since crumbled into debts and desperation. I had accepted his proposal because there was no alternative I could bear to consider, and because the girl who would have refused him, the girl who had loved a penniless clerk with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that made the world feel possible, that girl had died with Thomas in the river where they found his body last autumn. So I wore white to the Duke's midnight ball, a gown of silk and lace that cost more than my father earned in a year, and I let my maid arrange my hair with pearl pins that felt like tiny weights against my skull. My mother kissed my cheek before the carriage came and told me I looked like a duchess already, and I saw in her eyes that she had been afraid, truly afraid, that I would do something desperate, something that would destroy us all. I had not told her about the nights I woke, gasping, certain I had heard Thomas calling my name. I had not told her that I still kept his last letter hidden in the lining of my jewelry box, the paper worn soft from reading. I had not told her that I felt like a ghost myself, a pale thing moving through the world without touching it. The Duke's estate lay 10 miles north of London, a vast Gothic pile of grey stone that rose against the winter sky like something from a terrible dream. I had visited it twice before, once for tea with his formidable mother, and once for a garden party where I had smiled until my face ached and made polite conversation with women who looked at me with pity or envy or both. But I had never seen it at night, and as our carriage rolled up the long drive, I caught my breath despite myself. Every window blazed with light, not the warm gold of candles or gas lamps, but something brighter, harsher, more insistent. Electric light, I realized. The Duke had written to me about his plans to install the new Edison lamps throughout the house, to be the first in the county to embrace this modern wonder. But I had not imagined it would be so stark, so unforgiving. The other carriages were already arriving, disgorging guests in furs and jewels who exclaimed over the spectacle. I heard Lady Pemberton declare it magnificent, heard Lord Ashworth joke that the Duke meant to blind them all with progress, heard the nervous laughter that suggested no one quite knew what to make of it. Electric light was still rare, still strange, still regarded by some as unnatural. My own father had called it harsh and unhealthy when he read about it in the papers. But the Duke embraced all that was new and scientific, all that spoke of the future and of man's dominion over nature. He had shown me his library once, filled with books on engineering and chemistry and the new theories of electricity, and I had understood then that he saw the world as something to be understood and mastered, not felt or wondered at. A footman handed me down from the carriage, and I stood for a moment looking up at the house, at those brilliant windows that seemed to watch me like eyes. The January air was bitter, carrying the smell of coal smoke and frozen earth, and I pulled my cloak tighter as I climbed the steps. Inside, the entrance hall was so bright it made me blink. Chandeliers fitted with dozens of the strange new bulbs, casting everything in sharp relief. I could see every face with unnatural clarity, every jewel and wrinkle and false smile, and I felt suddenly exposed, as though I had stepped onto a stage where every flaw would be visible. The Duke was waiting at the foot of the grand staircase, receiving his guests with that cool, perfect courtesy that made him so admired. He wore black evening dress, severe and elegant, and when he saw me he smiled, a small precise movement of his lips that did not reach his eyes. He took my hand and raised it to his lips, and I felt the guests watching us, felt their approval like a weight. "Welcome, my dear," he said, his voice low and even. "I trust you are well." "I am, Your Grace," I replied, because that was what I always said, what I had learned to say. The title felt strange on my tongue still. Soon I would be his Duchess, and this vast, bright house would be my prison. He kept my hand in his as he turned to greet the next arrivals, and I stood beside him playing the role I had been given, smiling and nodding and feeling nothing at all. The ballroom lay beyond, I knew, where an orchestra would play and champagne would flow, and we would dance together while everyone watched and judged and whispered. I had danced with Thomas once, at a small party at my cousin's house, and he had held me as though I were precious and rare, and we had both known we were breaking every rule by caring for each other when he had no fortune and no prospects. I wondered if the Duke knew how to hold anything as though it mattered. The receiving line seemed endless, but finally the last guests had arrived and the Duke offered me his arm. "Shall we?" he said, and led me toward the ballroom, and I went because there was nowhere else to go. The ballroom took my breath away, and not with wonder. It was enormous, the ceiling soaring high above, and it was lit with what must have been 200 of the electric lamps arranged in great chandeliers and sconces and fixtures I had no names for. The light was merciless, revealing every corner, every face, every fold of fabric and glint of jewelry. There were no shadows anywhere, no soft places to hide or rest. The orchestra sat on a dais at the far end, the musicians blinking in the glare, and tables laden with crystal and silver lined the walls. Couples were already gathering on the floor, and I saw their faces bright with curiosity and excitement and something else, something that looked almost like fear. The Duke led me to the center of the room as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and I placed my hand on his shoulder and felt his arm circle my waist with perfect measured distance. He was an excellent dancer. I knew that already, moving with the precision of someone who had studied the steps as he studied everything until he could execute them flawlessly. We began to turn, and the other couples joined us, and the room filled with the swish of silk and the murmur of voices and the bright, relentless light. I was thinking of nothing, feeling nothing, my mind as blank as I could make it, when the lights began to flicker. It was subtle at first, just a brief dimming and brightening that made me glance up at the nearest chandelier. A fault in the wiring, perhaps, or some instability in the strange new machinery that powered them. But then it happened again, and I realized with a cold, creeping sensation that there was a pattern to it. Long, short, long. A pause. Then more. My heart began to pound. I knew that pattern. Everyone knew it, or at least everyone who read the papers. Everyone who had followed the stories of the telegraph and the messages sent racing across continents through copper wire. Morse code. The lamps were blinking in Morse code. I stumbled slightly, and the Duke's arm tightened around my waist. "Are you unwell?" he asked, his voice still even, still controlled. "No," I said. "No, I am quite well." But I was not well. I was staring at the lamps, watching them pulse and flicker, and my mind was racing to decipher the pattern even as some part of me screamed that this was impossible, that electric lamps could not carry messages, that I was imagining things born from grief and exhaustion. But I was not imagining it. The pattern continued, steady and deliberate, and slowly, painfully, I began to understand the letters forming in that stuttering light. THOMAS. M-A-S. I stopped dancing. I simply stopped, my feet frozen to the polished floor, my whole body rigid with shock. The Duke stopped too, looking down at me with something in his eyes that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. "My dear," he said, and there was a strange note in his voice, almost like satisfaction. "You have gone quite pale. Perhaps you should sit down." The lamps continued their terrible message. Lives, Thomas lives. I made a sound I could not control, something between a gasp and a sob, and the Duke took my arm firmly and began to guide me from the floor. The other dancers parted for us, their faces bright with curiosity, and I heard the whispers beginning. Saw Lady Pemberton lean close to her companion, saw the fans flutter and the eyebrows raise. But I could not care about any of that, because the lamps were still blinking, still spelling out impossible words that carved themselves into my heart like knives. Heknows. He knows. Who knows? What does he know? I was barely breathing now, the Duke's hand like iron on my arm as he led me toward the doors that opened onto the terrace. The night air hit my face, shockingly cold after the warmth of the ballroom, and I gasped and blinked and tried to think through the roaring in my ears. The Duke released my arm and stepped back, watching me with those pale, measuring eyes. "Better?" he asked, and I heard something in his tone that made my blood chill further. I turned to look back through the glass doors at the ballroom, at the dancers moving beneath those flickering lamps. They continued their pattern, slower now, as though whoever controlled them wanted to be certain I understood. YoursecretSarknown. I looked at the Duke, really looked at him for the first time, and I saw in his face a terrible calm, a coldness that went beyond mere reserve into something calculated and cruel. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew Thomas was alive. You knew about us." He smiled then, a real smile this time, and it was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. "My dear Miss Ashford," he said softly, and I realized he had used my maiden name deliberately, a subtle reminder that I was not his Duchess yet, not protected by his name or his power. "Did you truly think I would propose marriage to a woman without learning everything there was to know about her? I have had investigators watching you for months. I know about your little clerk, about your secret meetings, about the letters you thought were safely hidden. I know everything." The world tilted around me, and I gripped the terrace railing to keep from falling. "Then he is alive," I said. "Thomas is alive. Where is he? What have you done with him?" The Duke's smile widened, and he gestured toward the ballroom, toward those endlessly blinking lamps. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" he said. "After all, he is the one sending you messages. Though I must say, Miss Ashford, that it took you rather longer to notice than I expected. I had thought you more clever than that." And then he walked past me, back into the ballroom, leaving me alone on the terrace with the winter stars above and the terrible knowledge that the man I loved was somewhere in this vast house, somewhere close enough to manipulate the lights, somewhere trapped or hiding or desperately trying to warn me, and that the Duke who would be my husband had orchestrated all of this entire glittering nightmare, for reasons I could not yet fathom, but knew with cold certainty would destroy me if I did not learn to fight back. I stood on that terrace for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes, my mind racing through everything I thought I knew and finding it all turned to lies. Thomas was alive. Thomas was here. Thomas was somehow controlling the Duke's precious electric lamps, sending me messages that only I would understand, and the Duke had known all along, had planned it all along. But why? What game was he playing? And what did he want from me beyond the marriage he could have secured with silence and propriety? The cold finally drove me back inside, though I dreaded facing that bright room and those watching eyes. I could not simply flee, not without destroying what little remained of my family's reputation, not without confirming every suspicion that must already be racing through the ballroom. So I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin and walked back through the doors as though I were only a bride who had needed air, only a woman overcome by the excitement of her own engagement celebration. The Duke was dancing with Lady Pemberton, moving with that same perfect precision, and he did not look at me as I entered. But I felt his awareness of me as surely as I felt the heat from the blazing chandeliers. The lamps had stopped their flickering now, or perhaps they continued, but I could no longer bear to watch them, could no longer decipher their patterns when my whole body was shaking with the effort of appearing calm. "Miss Ashford," a voice said at my elbow, and I turned to find Lord Grayson, a pleasant man I had met at several dinners, offering me a glass of champagne. "You look as though you could use this." I took it gratefully, though my hand trembled slightly as I raised it to my lips. The champagne was cold and sharp, and it steadied me somewhat. "Thank you, Lord Grayson. I fear the excitement has quite overwhelmed me." He smiled kindly. "It is rather overwhelming, is it not? All this light. I confess I find it a bit unnatural. Give me good, honest candles any day. But the Duke is very proud of his installation. He has been telling everyone that this is the future, that within 10 years every great house in England will be lit this way." I forced myself to smile back, to play the part expected of me. "He is very forward-thinking." "Indeed," Lord Grayson said, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. "Too forward," some would say. There are those who believe we should not tamper with certain forces. Electricity is powerful, Miss Ashford. Dangerous, even. One must be careful how one harnesses it. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He glanced around as though checking who might overhear, then leaned closer. "Only that the Duke has been conducting experiments in his laboratory, things involving the electric current and its effects on the human mind and body. I have heard rumors from his staff. They say he believes electricity can be used to influence thought, to extract memories, even to control behavior. Of course, such things are likely exaggerated. But still, one wonders what a man like the Duke might do with such power, if it were truly possible." I stared at him, my mind reeling. A laboratory, experiments, control. And Thomas, somewhere in this house, manipulating the lamps. Could he be a prisoner? Could the Duke have been using him in these experiments? The thought was so horrible, I nearly dropped my glass. "Are you quite all right, Miss Ashford?" Lord Grayson asked, concern creasing his brow. "Yes," I managed, "only I think I need to sit down." He guided me to a chair along the wall, and I sank into it gratefully. Lord Grayson bowed and moved away, and I was left alone with my thoughts and the terrible revelations crowding my mind. I needed to find Thomas. I needed to understand what was happening. But how could I search this vast house during a ball, with hundreds of guests and servants everywhere, and with the Duke watching me as a cat watches a mouse it plans to devour at leisure? The waltz ended, and the Duke appeared before me, offering his hand. "Another dance, my dear?" His eyes were cold and amused, and I knew he was testing me, waiting to see if I would refuse him in front of all these people, if I would make a scene that would ruin us both. I took his hand because I had no choice, and we moved back onto the floor as the orchestra began a new piece. This time I was ready when the lamps started their flickering, and I watched them without appearing to, reading their message while I smiled up at the Duke and let him guide me through the steps. BASEMENTTEASTWINGMIDNIGHT, basement, East Wing, midnight. Thomas was telling me where to find him or where to meet him, and the Duke was letting him do it. No, more than that. The Duke wanted me to receive these messages, wanted me to know Thomas was here. "But why?" "You are very quiet this evening," the Duke said, his voice low enough that only I could hear beneath the music. "Are you not enjoying your ball?" I met his eyes and saw the challenge there, the expectation that I would pretend, would play my role as the grateful bride. Instead, I found myself speaking words I had not planned. "Why are you doing this? If you know about Thomas, if you have known all along, why propose marriage to me at all? Why not simply expose us and be done with it?" His smile was thin and sharp. "Because, my dear Miss Ashford, I do not want a wife who merely tolerates me out of duty. I want one who understands exactly what I am capable of, who knows the futility of defiance, who has learned through bitter experience that I hold all the cards and she holds none. Your little clerk has been very useful in that education. He has a clever mind, you know. The way he worked out how to manipulate the electric current from the control room was quite ingenious. Of course, he did not realize I was allowing it. He thought he was being terribly brave, sending you these secret messages. Touching, really. Rage flooded through me, hot and purifying, burning away the numbness I had carried for so long. You monster. You are keeping him prisoner. You are using him in your experiments. The Duke's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Experiments is such a dramatic word. I prefer to think of it as research. And he volunteered. You know, though perhaps not for the reasons he believed. When my men fished him from the river last autumn, when they revived him and brought him here, he was quite grateful. He thought I was saving him out of the goodness of my heart. It was only later that he understood the price of that salvation. The room spun around me, and I thought I might be sick. You pulled him from the river. You let everyone believe he was dead. You let me believe it. I let you grieve, the Duke said calmly, as we turned beneath the flickering lamps. I let you become the perfect broken creature I needed, the one who would accept my proposal without question because she no longer cared what happened to her. And it worked beautifully, did it not? You said yes. Your mother wept with relief. All of London society approved the match. And now here we are, dancing at your engagement ball, and you have just learned that the man you loved never died at all, but has been here all along, living under my roof, subject to my will. Tell me, Miss Ashford, how does that knowledge feel? I wanted to slap him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear myself from his arms and run until I found Thomas and freed him from whatever horror he had endured. But I did none of those things because I was my mother's daughter, because I had been trained since childhood in the art of endurance, and because I understood with sudden cold clarity that the Duke wanted me to break, wanted me to give him an excuse to punish us both even more cruelly. So instead, I smiled, a real smile this time, one that held all the rage and determination I had discovered I still possessed. It feels, I said sweetly, like the beginning of a very interesting negotiation. You hold Thomas prisoner, and you think that gives you power over me. But you forget, Your Grace, that you need this marriage as much as I do. Your mother has been pressuring you to produce an heir for years, and your reputation as a cold, eccentric scientist makes you undesirable to most respectable families. You chose me because I seemed broken and desperate. But I am not so broken as you think. And I am not so foolish as to dance to your tune without understanding what you want from me beyond a wedding ring and a nursery full of children. For the first time since I had known him, the Duke looked genuinely surprised. The waltz ended, and we stood facing each other in the bright electric glare, and I saw calculation race across his features. Well, he said slowly, perhaps I underestimated you after all. Very well, Miss Ashford. Let us negotiate. What is it you want? I want to see Thomas, I said. Tonight, alone. And I want your word that you will not harm him further, regardless of what I decide about our engagement. The Duke studied me for a long moment, and I held his gaze without flinching. Around us, the other guests were watching, murmuring, sensing something amiss, though they could not know what. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. Very well. At midnight, as your faithful clerk suggested, the East Wing basement, there is a door at the end of the long gallery. It will be unlocked. You may have 15 minutes with him, no more. And Miss Ashford? He leaned close, his breath cold against my ear. If you attempt to help him escape, If you do anything foolish, I will ensure that he suffers for it in ways you cannot imagine. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, though my voice shook slightly. "Excellent," the Duke said, and stepped back. "Now, I believe supper is about to be served. Shall we?" He offered his arm again, and I took it. And we walked together into the supper room, where long tables groaned with delicacies, and the guests gathered like bright birds, chattering and laughing and utterly unaware that beneath their feet, in the dark basement of this terrible house, the man I loved was waiting for me in a prison of the Duke's making. I ate nothing at supper, though I moved food around my plate and smiled at the appropriate moments and accepted congratulations from people whose names I barely registered. The Duke sat beside me, charming and attentive, playing his role as the devoted fiancé, and I played mine as well, though my mind was racing ahead to midnight, to that door in the east wing, to Thomas. The clock in the supper room chimed 11, and I counted every minute that followed. The Duke rose eventually and moved among his guests, accepting their compliments on the splendid ball and the miraculous electric lights, and I slipped away from the table and made my way through the crowded rooms toward the long gallery. No one seemed to notice me go. I was just the bride, after all, just a decoration for the evening. And decorations are easy to overlook once the novelty fades. The long gallery was dimmer than the ballroom, lit by fewer lamps, and my footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Portraits of the Duke's ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow me, and I shivered despite my silk shawl. At the end of the gallery, I found the door, exactly where the Duke had said it would be, a narrow wooden thing that looked like a servant's entrance. I tried the handle. It turned smoothly, revealing steep stone steps leading down into darkness. There was a switch on the wall, and I pressed it, and electric light flooded the stairwell, harsh and unforgiving. I descended slowly, my skirts rustling against the stone, and tried not to think about what I was walking into. The basement was a maze of corridors and rooms, storage spaces and wine cellars, and places whose purpose I could not guess. But there was light coming from beneath one door at the far end of the main passage, and I walked toward it as though drawn by invisible strings. I knocked softly. "Thomas," I whispered. "Thomas, are you there?" For a moment there was only silence, and I thought perhaps I had been tricked. Perhaps this was another of the Duke's cruel games. But then I heard movement, and the door opened, and Thomas stood before me. He was thinner than I remembered, his face drawn and pale in the electric light, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of exhaustion and strain. But he was alive, he was real, and when he saw me, his whole face transformed with such joy and pain mingled together that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Eleanor," he breathed, and then I was in his arms, and he was holding me as though he would never let go. And I was sobbing against his shoulder, while he murmured my name over and over, like a prayer. We stood like that for a long moment, clinging to each other in that damp basement room while above us the ball continued, and the Duke waited to see what I would do next. Finally, Thomas pulled back enough to look at my face, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "You should not have come," he said, though his eyes said the opposite. "It is dangerous. He will use this against you." "I know," I said. "I know what he is. I know what he has been doing." "Thomas, how long have you been here? What has he done to you?" He released me and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered so well it made my heart ache. "Since October," he said quietly. "His men pulled me from the river and brought me here. At first I thought I was being rescued. By the time I understood the truth, it was too late. He has been using me in his experiments, Eleanor, trying to map the effects of electric current on the mind. He believes he can use electricity to extract memories, to plant suggestions, even to control behavior. And he is not entirely wrong. I have seen things, felt things, that should not be possible. I felt sick. "The control room," I said. "You have access to the electric system." He nodded grimly. He allows me to work on it, to maintain it. He thinks he is giving me purpose, keeping me occupied. He does not realize I have been studying it, learning how to manipulate it. The messages I sent you tonight, I had to be so careful, so subtle. If he knew what I was truly capable of, he would kill me or lock me away somewhere I could never reach the wiring. Then we must get you out, I said urgently. We must find a way to escape, both of us. Thomas looked at me with such sadness that I wanted to weep. And go where, Eleanor? I am a dead man, officially. I have no identity, no prospects, no way to provide for you. And you are engaged to one of the most powerful men in England. If we run, he will find us. He will destroy your family, ruin your name, and ensure that I suffer more than you can imagine. I know him now. I know what he is capable of. Then what do we do? I whispered. How do we fight him? Thomas took my hands in his, and I felt the calluses on his fingers, the strength in his grip. We do what I have been planning since I discovered the extent of his system, he said quietly. We use his own weapons against him. The electric installation in this house is more than just lighting, Eleanor. It is a network, a web of wires and current and control that reaches into every room. If we can access the main control panel, if we can manipulate it properly, we can expose him. We can show his guests exactly what he has been doing here, broadcast it somehow through the lights, or perhaps through sound if I can work out the mechanism. We can ruin him the way he planned to ruin us. I stared at him, hope and terror warring in my chest. But that would be dangerous. He would know it was you. He would kill you. Perhaps, Thomas said. Or perhaps he would be too busy trying to salvage his reputation to bother with revenge. Either way, it is the only plan I have. And Eleanor, I cannot let you marry him. I cannot let him have you. I would rather die trying to stop it than live knowing you are his. The clock somewhere above us began to chime midnight, and I knew my 15 minutes were gone. I squeezed Thomas's hands. Then we do it together, I said. Tell me what you need from me. Tell me how I can help. But we do this together. Or not at all. He smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from him, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Together, he agreed. Now go, before he comes looking for you. I will send you more messages through the lamps. Watch for them, learn from them. And Eleanor? He pulled me close for one more embrace. I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. I kissed him then, quickly, desperately, tasting salt from my tears and feeling his hands in my hair. And then I pulled away and ran back up the stairs before I could lose my courage. The gallery was still empty, the ball still raging in the distance, and I slipped back among the guests with my heart pounding and my mind racing with plans and possibilities and the terrible knowledge that the man I loved was alive but trapped, and that the only way to free him was to destroy the monster who held us both in his grip. The days following the midnight ball passed with excruciating slowness, each hour weighted with dread and desperate hope. I returned home the morning after, pleading exhaustion, and my mother fussed over me with worry that I might be falling ill so close to the wedding preparations. The Duke sent flowers, enormous arrangements of white roses that filled our drawing room with their cloying scent, and notes written in his precise hand, asking after my health and expressing his devotion. I read them with bile rising in my throat, knowing that every word was a carefully crafted lie, a performance for my mother and for society. But at night, when the house was dark and silent, I would light a single candle and watch it flicker. And I would think of Thomas in that basement room, working on his plans, studying the wiring and circuits that might be our salvation. He had promised to send me messages, and I waited for them with the kind of anticipation that was both agony and sustenance. They came on the third day. I was sitting in the parlor with my mother, pretending to embroider while she chattered about wedding details, when the electric lamp on the side table began to pulse. My mother did not notice, absorbed as she was in her lists of guests and menus, but I saw the pattern immediately. STUDYHISROUTINELEARNHISSCHEDULE. Study his routine. Learn his schedule. Thomas was telling me to observe the Duke, to understand his movements and habits so we would know when to strike. I nodded slightly, though of course he could not see me, and the lamp returned to its steady glow. Over the following week, I became a student of the Duke's patterns. He called on me every other afternoon, arriving precisely at 3 o'clock and staying for exactly 1 hour. He took me driving in Hyde Park twice, showing me off to society, his hand possessive on my arm as we walked past the winter-bare trees and frozen serpentine. He invited me to dinner at his London house, a smaller but equally grand establishment in Belgrave Square, where I met more of his scientific friends and colleagues, men who spoke enthusiastically about electricity and engineering and the marvelous future that awaited mankind. I smiled and nodded and played the dutiful fiancé, but I was watching, always watching. I noticed that the Duke left London every Monday and Thursday, traveling to his estate for what he called his laboratory work. I noticed that he carried a small leather notebook everywhere, making notes in it constantly, and that he became irritated when interrupted while writing. I noticed that he drank exactly 2 glasses of wine with dinner, never more, and that he retired early, claiming he needed clear head for his experiments. And I noticed the way he looked at me sometimes, with a cold curiosity that made my skin crawl, as though I were one of his specimens, something to be studied and understood, and ultimately controlled. The lamps in our house continued their messages, always when my mother was occupied elsewhere, or had dozed off in her chair. HEGOESTOLABORATORUSDAY. Thomas told me. MAINCONTROLROOMADJACENT, and then, days later, the message that made my heart race with fear and hope mingled. NEXTTUESDAYBEREADY, next Tuesday, 5 days away. I had no idea what Thomas was planning, what he expected me to do, but I knew I had to trust him. He was the one who understood the electric system, who had spent months learning its secrets and vulnerabilities. My role was simply to be there, to support him, to do whatever he asked when the moment came. The Duke invited me to dine at his estate that Tuesday, and I accepted with a calmness that surprised me. My mother was thrilled, seeing it as another sign of his devotion, another step toward the wedding that would save us from poverty and disgrace. She helped me dress in a gown of deep blue silk, arranged my hair with sapphire pins that had belonged to my grandmother, and kissed my cheek as the Duke's carriage arrived to collect me. "Be charming," she whispered. "Be everything he deserves." I promised her I would, and I meant it, though not in the way she imagined. The drive to the estate took nearly 2 hours, and I spent them watching the winter landscape roll past and trying to calm my racing thoughts. What if Thomas's plan failed? What if the Duke discovered what we were attempting? What if I never saw my mother again, never had the chance to explain or apologize or say goodbye? But beneath the fear was something else, something fierce and determined that I had not known I possessed until that night at the ball when I had looked into the Duke's cold eyes and refused to break. The house loomed against the darkening sky as we approached, every window blazing with electric light as though in defiance of the gathering dusk. The Duke met me at the entrance, impeccable as always in his evening clothes, and offered his arm. "You look lovely, my dear," he said, and I thought I detected genuine appreciation in his voice, as though I were a painting he had commissioned and found satisfactory. "Thank you, Your Grace," I replied, and let him lead me inside. Dinner was served in a small dining room off the main hall, just the 2 of us, with servants moving silently to bring course after course of exquisite food that I could barely taste. The Duke spoke about his latest experiments, describing them with the enthusiasm of a child with a new toy, and I listened with apparent fascination while my mind raced ahead to whatever Thomas had planned. "I have been making remarkable progress," the Duke said, as the servants cleared the main course. "The relationship between electric current and neural pathways is far more complex than I initially believed. It is not simply a matter of stimulation or suppression, you see, but of creating new pathways, new patterns of thought. I believe that within a few years I will be able to use electricity to alter memory itself, to remove trauma or implant suggestion as easily as a surgeon might remove a tumor." He spoke as though this were a wonderful thing, a gift to humanity, and I felt revulsion rise in my throat. "And your test subject," I said carefully. "How does he fare under these experiments?" The Duke smiled. "Your clerk is proving remarkably resilient. His mind is quite strong, actually, which makes him an excellent subject. Of course, the process is not without discomfort, but he endures it well. I believe he understands that he is contributing to something greater than himself." I wanted to throw my wine in his face, to scream at him that Thomas was not a test subject, but a human being, that what he was doing was torture dressed up as science. But I only nodded and took another sip, because I had to play my part just a little longer. After dinner, the Duke suggested we take coffee in his library, and I agreed, my heart pounding because I knew the library was on the second floor, far from the basement where Thomas waited, far from whatever he needed me to be near. But I could not refuse without arousing suspicion. So I followed the Duke up the grand staircase and into a room lined floor to ceiling with books and dominated by a massive desk covered in papers and strange mechanical devices. "Do you take an interest in science, Miss Ashford?" the Duke asked, pouring coffee from a silver pot. "I confess I know very little of it," I said, which was true enough. "But I am eager to learn." He looked pleased by this answer. "Excellent. A duchess should be able to converse intelligently about her husband's work. Here, let me show you something." He led me to a cabinet against the far wall and unlocked it with a key from his pocket. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, filled with diagrams and equations and notes written in the Duke's meticulous hand. "This is my life's work," he said, running his fingers along the spines with something like tenderness. "Everything I have learned about the human mind and how it might be shaped through electrical intervention. One day, perhaps, you will help me with this research. You have an observant eye, I have noticed. You would make an excellent assistant." I felt as though I might be sick, but I forced myself to look interested, to lean closer and examine the notebooks as though they fascinated rather than horrified me. "What would you have me do?" I asked. "Oh, simple things at first. Recording observations during experiments, monitoring the subject's responses. Perhaps, eventually, helping to refine the techniques." The Duke's voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp on my face, measuring my reaction. "Of course, we would need to ensure your loyalty first. I cannot have someone working with me who might be squeamish about the methods or sympathetic to the subjects." I understood then that this was a test, that he was waiting to see if I would reveal my true feelings, if I would betray myself. So I met his eyes and smiled. "I am not squeamish, Your Grace, and I understand that progress often requires sacrifice. If my former attachment has contributed to your work, then perhaps his suffering has purpose after all." It was the hardest thing I had ever said, and for a moment I thought I saw surprise flicker across the Duke's face. Then he nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. "Very good. I believe we shall deal very well together, you and I." At that moment, the lights began to flicker. Not in the subtle pattern of Morse code, but violently, chaotically, dimming and brightening and dimming again, as though something had gone terribly wrong with the wiring. The Duke frowned and moved to the door, peering out into the corridor where other lamps were exhibiting the same behavior. "Curious," he muttered. "There must be a fault in the main system." He turned back to me. "Wait here, my dear. I shall return shortly." He strode from the room, and I heard his footsteps receding down the corridor toward the stairs. As soon as he was gone, I ran to the window and looked down at the grounds below. I could see nothing unusual, only darkness and the pale glow of snow on the lawns. But the lights continued their mad dance, and I knew this was Thomas's doing, knew he was calling me somehow, telling me to move, to act. I left the library and made my way quickly down the servants' staircase at the back of the house, the one I had noticed during my previous visits but never used. It led down to the kitchens and the warren of service corridors beyond, and I followed them by instinct and memory until I found myself at the door to the basement. It was unlocked, as though Thomas had known I would come this way. I descended the stone steps, my skirts gathered in one hand, and found him in the control room at the bottom, surrounded by switches and panels and coils of copper wire that hummed with barely contained energy. He was working frantically, throwing switches and connecting wires, his face intense with concentration. "Eleanor," he said when he saw me, relief and fear warring in his voice. "Thank God. I was not certain you would understand the signal. Listen carefully. We do not have much time. I have disconnected the main controls from the Duke's laboratory. He will go there first to check on his equipment, and when he does, I need you to lock him in. The laboratory has a heavy door with a bolt on the outside. If you can trap him there, even for a few minutes, it will give me time to complete what I am doing here." "What are you doing?" I asked, moving closer to look at the bewildering array of machinery. He gestured at a large panel covered in switches and dials. "I am rewiring the entire system to broadcast through every lamp in the house simultaneously. Not just Morse code this time, but something more. He has been using electricity to extract and record memories, Eleanor. His notebooks describe the technique, and I have been studying them. If I can reverse the process, I can use his own equipment to project those memories outward, to make everyone in the house see what he has been doing, feel what his victims have felt. It will be undeniable, inescapable. It will destroy him." I stared at him, hardly daring to believe. "You can do this? You can make people see his crimes?" "I can try," Thomas said grimly. "But I need time, and I need him away from the controls. Please, Eleanor, go to the laboratory, lock him in, and then run. Do not wait for me. Do not look back. When this is over, if I survive, I will find you. But if I do not, promise me you will leave this place and never return." I took his face in my hands and kissed him, hard and quick. "I am not leaving without you," I said fiercely. "We do this together or not at all. Now tell me where the laboratory is." He gave me directions, his voice urgent, and I memorized them quickly. Then I ran back up the stairs and through the corridors, following the path he had described, past the kitchens and the wine cellar and through a narrow passage I had never seen before. At the end was a heavy iron door standing slightly ajar, and I could hear the Duke's voice from within, angry and puzzled as he examined his equipment. I did not let myself think. I simply stepped forward, grabbed the door, and pulled it shut with all my strength. The bolt was stiff, but I managed to slide it home just as the Duke realized what was happening. He shouted, and I heard him throw himself against the door, but it was solid iron and designed to contain whatever experiments he conducted within. It would hold him, at least for a while. I ran back toward the basement, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear the Duke's muffled screaming, promising vengeance, promising ruin, and I knew that if Thomas's plan failed, if we could not expose him, then everything the Duke threatened would come to pass. When I reached the control room, Thomas was connecting the last wires, his hands moving with desperate speed. "Almost there," he muttered. "Almost. Eleanor, when I throw this final switch, every lamp in the house is going to show them. The guests in the drawing rooms, the servants in their quarters, everyone is going to see his laboratory, his experiments, his victims. They are going to see me, what he did to me. And they are going to see you too. Our meetings. Our love, everything he held over us. Are you ready for that? Are you ready for everyone to know?" I took his hand. "I am ready," I said. "Do it." He looked at me for one long moment, his eyes full of love and sorrow and determination. Then he turned back to the panel and threw the switch. The whole system surged with power, the hum becoming a roar, and every light in the house blazed brilliant white, and then shifted, changed, became something else entirely. I could not see what they showed, trapped as we were in the basement, but I heard the screams beginning above us, heard the cries of shock and horror. And I knew that Thomas had succeeded, that the Duke's secrets were spilling out for all the world to witness, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The screams did not stop. They echoed through the house like a choir of the damned, rising and falling as the electric lights pulsed and flickered with the images Thomas had unleashed. I stood beside him in the control room, watching his face as he monitored the system, adjusting dials and switches to maintain the broadcast, and I saw the strain there, the terrible cost of what he was doing. His hands shook and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold of the basement, and I realized with a sick jolt that he was connected to the system somehow, that channeling these memories through the electrical current was draining something essential from him. "Thomas," I said, reaching for him. "Stop. You are hurting yourself." He shook his head without taking his eyes from the panel. "Not yet. They need to see it all. They need to understand what he is capable of." Just a few more minutes. I heard footsteps on the stairs above us, heavy and rapid, and then voices shouting. The servants, perhaps, or some of the Duke's scientific colleagues who had been visiting the estate. Thomas tensed, his finger hovering over a large switch that I guessed would shut down the entire system. "Wait," I said urgently. "Let me go up. Let me see what is happening. You stay here and keep the broadcast running as long as you can." "Eleanor, no. It is too dangerous." I kissed him quickly, fiercely. "Everything we have done has been dangerous. Trust me. I will come back for you." Before he could argue further, I ran up the stairs and emerged into chaos. The servants' corridor was crowded with people, maids and footmen and cooks, all standing frozen, staring up at the electric lamps with expressions of horror and disbelief. I could see what they were seeing now, reflected in their wide eyes and pale faces. The lamps were not simply glowing, but projecting images somehow, ghostly flickering scenes that played across the air itself like magic lantern shows, but far more vivid, far more real. I saw Thomas strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to his temples, his body convulsing as the Duke stood beside him with a notebook, calmly recording observations. I saw other men too, other victims I did not recognize, subjected to the same treatment, and some of them did not survive it. I saw their bodies carried away, saw the Duke burying them in the woods behind the estate under cover of darkness. And I saw myself, my meetings with Thomas before his supposed death, our stolen kisses and whispered promises, all the things the Duke had known about and used against us. The servants were weeping, some of them. Others looked angry, their faces flushed with outrage. A footman I recognized from dinner pointed at me with a shaking hand. "You are the lady in the images," he said, "the one he was going to marry. Did you know? Did you know what he was doing?" "Not until recently," I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. "But I know now, and that is why we are stopping him. That is why you are seeing this. The Duke of Ashford is a monster, and he has been using his wealth and position to hide his crimes. But not anymore. There was a tremendous crash from somewhere above us, and we all jumped. The sound of splintering wood, and then the Duke's voice roaring with fury. He had broken out of the laboratory. He was coming. "Run!" I shouted at the servants. "Get out of this house. Go to the village. Tell the magistrate, tell everyone what you have seen. Do not let him silence you." Some of them fled immediately, gathering their cloaks and rushing for the servants' entrance. Others hesitated, confused and frightened, unsure whether to obey me or their master. I did not wait to see what they decided. I ran back down to the basement, where Thomas was still maintaining the broadcast, his face now deathly pale and his breathing labored. "He is free," I said. "Thomas, we have to go. We have to run now while the servants are witness, while people know the truth." Thomas nodded weakly and reached for the main switch. As his hand closed on it, preparing to shut down the system, the basement door burst open and the Duke appeared at the top of the stairs. His usually immaculate appearance was destroyed. His jacket was torn, his face scratched where he had clawed at the iron door, and his eyes burned with a rage so intense it seemed inhuman. "You," he said, his voice low and deadly as he started down the stairs. You dare to use my own equipment against me. You dare to expose me in my own house. I will kill you both. I will make you suffer in ways you cannot imagine." Thomas stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body, even though he could barely stand. "You have already made me suffer," he said, and his voice was steady despite his weakness. "You have tortured me for months. You have killed innocent men in the name of your experiments. You threatened the woman I love. But it is over now, Your Grace. Everyone has seen what you are. Everyone knows." The Duke laughed, a terrible sound without humor. "You think this changes anything? You think society will believe the word of a dead clerk and a desperate woman over mine? I am the Duke of Ashford. My family has held power in this country for 300 years. I have friends in Parliament, in the courts, in every institution that matters. By tomorrow, this will be dismissed as a hoax, a mechanical trick, the delusions of a madman and his accomplice. You have accomplished nothing except ensuring your own destruction." He was close now, close enough that I could see the madness in his eyes, the absolute conviction that he was untouchable. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps we had risked everything for nothing. But then I heard more footsteps on the stairs, and Lord Grayson appeared, the kind man who had warned me about the Duke's experiments at the ball. He was not alone. Behind him came other guests, men and women of society who had been in the house when the broadcast began, and their faces were grim. "Your Grace," Lord Grayson said, and his voice was cold with disgust. "I have sent my carriage to fetch the magistrate. The others are gathering the servants to give statements. What we have witnessed tonight, what your own electrical equipment has revealed, cannot be ignored or dismissed. Whatever power you believe you hold, it will not protect you from justice when there are dozens of witnesses and physical evidence of your crimes." The Duke turned to face them, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across his features. "You do not understand," he said. "My work is important. I was on the verge of breakthroughs that would revolutionize medicine, that would allow us to heal the mind as easily as we heal the body. Those men volunteered. They understood the risks." "They did not volunteer," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength from the support of the witnesses. "You kidnapped them. You faked my death so you could use me without interference. You murdered those who did not survive your experiments and buried them like animals. That is not science, Your Grace. That is evil." The Duke's face contorted with rage, and he lunged toward Thomas with his hands outstretched as though he meant to strangle him. But Lord Grayson and 2 other men caught him, wrestling him back despite his struggles. "We will hold him until the authorities arrive," Lord Grayson said. "Miss Ashford, you and your companion should come upstairs. You will need to give testimony." The next hours passed in a blur of questions and chaos. The magistrate arrived with constables, and the Duke was placed under arrest, despite his protests and threats. Doctors were summoned to examine Thomas and determine the extent of the damage the experiments had caused. Servants gave statements describing the strange activities they had witnessed in the laboratory, the sounds of screaming late at night, the unexplained comings and goings. Several of Lord Grayson's party confirmed they had seen the electrical broadcast and could testify to its contents. I sat in the drawing room wrapped in a blanket someone had provided, watching it all unfold with a strange detachment. My engagement was ended, obviously. My reputation was in tatters, my secret love exposed to all of society. My mother would be devastated when the news reached her. We would probably be ruined socially. might even have to leave London entirely. But Thomas was alive. Thomas was free. And the Duke, for all his power and wealth, was being led away in chains to answer for his crimes. "Miss Ashford," Lord Grayson said gently, sitting down beside me, "you are very brave, you know. What you did tonight, helping to expose him, that took tremendous courage." I did not feel brave. I felt exhausted and frightened and uncertain of what would happen next. "Will they believe us?" I asked. "Will they truly hold him accountable, or will he find some way to escape justice?" Lord Grayson sighed. "I will not lie to you. He has considerable influence, and there will be those who wish to protect him, to keep this scandal from touching their own families and institutions. But the evidence is overwhelming. The memories recorded in his electrical system, the bodies buried on his property, the testimony of so many witnesses. It will be difficult even for a duke to explain away. And there are some of us, Miss Ashford, who have long suspected that something was amiss here, who will ensure that this matter is pursued to its conclusion, regardless of who wishes otherwise." I nodded, grateful for his certainty, even if I could not quite share it. "And Thomas?" I asked. "How is he?" "The doctor is with him now. He has been weakened by the experiments and by the effort of manipulating the electrical system, but the doctor believes he will recover with time and rest. You will be able to see him soon." Lord Grayson left me then to speak with the magistrate, and I sat alone in that bright, terrible room where only hours ago I had dined with a monster and pretended to accept his vision of our future together. The electric lamps glowed steadily now, their secrets told, and I thought about how Thomas had taken the Duke's own weapon and turned it against him, how he had suffered and survived and ultimately found a way to fight back. A servant appeared at the door and told me Thomas was asking for me. I followed her through the house to a small bedroom where Thomas lay propped against pillows, still pale but with more color than he had shown in the basement. The doctor finished examining him and nodded to me before leaving us alone. Thomas held out his hand, and I took it, sitting on the edge of the bed and feeling tears finally begin to fall. "We did it," I whispered. "We stopped him." "We did," Thomas agreed, squeezing my fingers. "Though I am not certain what comes next, Eleanor. I am still officially dead. I have no position, no prospects. And you have been dragged through scandal because of me. Your engagement is broken. Your name will be spoken of in whispers. I have ruined you." I shook my head fiercely. "You have saved me. I would rather be ruined and free than be a duchess in that monster's house. We will find a way forward, Thomas. We will rebuild our lives somehow." He pulled me close then, and I rested my head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him and feeling, for the first time in months, that I was truly home. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break over the estate, pale light touching the snow-covered grounds where the Duke's victims lay buried. There would be justice for them now. There would be truth. And there would be, I dared to hope, a future for Thomas and me that was built not on secrets and fear, but on the courage we had found in each other when everything seemed lost. The lamps in the room glowed softly, innocent now, just light and nothing more. The Duke's terrible vision of using electricity to control and manipulate had been defeated by Thomas using that same electricity to reveal and expose. Science, I thought, was neither good nor evil in itself. It was only a tool, and everything depended on the hands that wielded it and the heart that guided those hands. I stayed beside Thomas as the sun rose, as the constables completed their work, and the guests departed, and the house fell silent at last. We had survived the Duke's midnight ball and the horrors it concealed. Now we would face whatever consequences came, but we would face them together, and that made all the difference in the world. The trial of the Duke of Ashford became the scandal of the season, dominating every newspaper and conversation in London society for months. I was called to testify, as was Thomas, and we stood before the court and told our stories while the Duke sat in the dock, looking furious and disbelieving, as though he still could not comprehend that his world of absolute power had collapsed around him. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically: the bodies discovered on the estate, the electrical apparatus used in the experiments, the testimony of servants and witnesses who had seen the broadcast that terrible night. The Duke's lawyers argued that he had been conducting legitimate scientific research, that his subjects had been willing volunteers, that the images projected through the electrical system had been fabricated or misinterpreted. But the jury did not believe them. How could they, when Thomas stood before them bearing the scars of the electrodes, when the servants wept as they described the screams they had heard from the laboratory, when Lord Grayson and others of impeccable reputation swore they had witnessed the Duke's crimes revealed through his own equipment? The verdict was guilty on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and torture. The Duke was sentenced to life imprisonment, his title stripped, his estates confiscated by the Crown. His family disowned him. His name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked ambition and the perversion of science in service of cruelty. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. But mostly I felt exhausted and sad for all the victims who had not survived to see justice done. My own situation was complicated in ways I had not anticipated. The scandal did ruin me socially, as I had expected. Invitations ceased, old friends crossed the street to avoid me, and my mother wept bitter tears over what she called my foolishness in becoming entangled with the Duke's crimes. But there were others, unexpected allies, who reached out with kindness. Lady Pemberton, whom I had thought cared only for gossip and status, sent a note saying she had always found the Duke unsettling and was glad to see justice served. Several families who had lost sons or brothers under mysterious circumstances years ago came forward to thank me for helping expose what had happened to their loved ones. And Lord Grayson became a steady friend, visiting regularly and making it clear through his continued association that he did not hold me responsible for the Duke's evil. Thomas's recovery was slow but steady. The doctors said the electrical experiments had damaged his nervous system in ways they did not fully understand, leaving him with tremors and headaches that might never fully heal. But his mind was sharp as ever, and as his strength returned, so did his determination to rebuild his life. The problem was that he remained officially dead, his name removed from all records, and restoring his legal existence proved maddeningly difficult. It required lawyers, affidavits, testimony from those who had known him before, and months of bureaucratic wrangling. During that time, Thomas stayed in modest lodgings in Bloomsbury, and I visited him as often as propriety would allow, which was not often enough. My mother forbade me from seeing him at first, horrified that I would associate with a man who had no position and whose connection to me had caused such scandal. We argued bitterly, the first real arguments of my life, and I discovered that the girl who had been docile and obedient had died somewhere in the Duke's bright ballroom, replaced by a woman who knew her own mind and would not be moved from what she believed was right. "I love him," I told my mother one night when she had pushed me too far. "I have always loved him, and I will continue to love him whether you approve or not. If that means I must live in poverty and disgrace, then so be it. I would rather have 1 year of genuine happiness with Thomas than a lifetime of wealth without him." My mother stared at me as though I were a stranger, and perhaps I was. Then she began to cry, not the delicate tears of a lady, but harsh, wrenching sobs. "You do not understand," she said between gasps. "You do not understand what poverty truly means, what it does to a person. Your father and I have protected you from the worst of it. But Eleanor, we are drowning in debt. Without the Duke's settlement, without a good marriage for you, we will lose the house, lose everything. I am not cruel, I am not heartless, I am desperate. I held her while she wept, and for the first time I truly understood the impossible position she had been in, the weight of responsibility she had carried. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I am so sorry, Mama, but I cannot marry for money. I cannot sell myself to save us. There must be another way." We found one, though not in the way either of us expected. Lord Grayson, who had developed a deep respect for Thomas during the trial, offered him a position as a consultant on electrical systems. Several factories and businesses were beginning to install electric lighting, and they needed people who understood the technology. Thomas's months of studying the Duke's equipment, his natural brilliance with mechanical systems, made him uniquely qualified. The pay was modest but steady, enough to support himself and eventually, he hoped, a family. And I, to everyone's shock including my own, was offered a position as well. A journalist from the Times had covered the trial extensively and had been impressed by my testimony and my role in exposing the Duke. She approached me with a proposal. Would I be willing to write about my experiences, to tell the story from my perspective as a woman caught between duty and love? Between society's expectations and personal morality? The idea terrified me. Nice women did not write for newspapers. Nice women did not draw attention to themselves or discuss such scandalous matters in public. But I was no longer a nice woman by society's standards, and I discovered I did not particularly care. I wrote the articles over several weeks, pouring out everything I had felt and feared and learned during those terrible months. I wrote about the pressure on women to marry, well regardless of personal feeling, about the way wealth and title could conceal monstrous behavior, about the courage it took to choose truth over comfort. The response was overwhelming. Some condemned me as immodest and inappropriate, but others, particularly young women facing similar pressures, wrote to thank me for giving voice to their own struggles. The newspaper offered me more work, writing about women's issues and social reform, and I accepted. Spring came slowly that year, winter reluctant to release its grip on London. But eventually, the days lengthened and warmed, and Thomas's legal status was finally restored. He had a position, modest savings, and he told me one afternoon as we walked in the park where the trees were budding green, enough to offer me something other than disgrace and scandal. He stopped beneath a willow tree and took my hands in his. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice shook slightly, "I know I am not what your mother wanted for you. I know I can never give you the wealth or status you might have had, but I can give you honesty and loyalty and a love that has survived death and torture and everything the Duke could devise. Will you marry me? Not because you must, not to save your family or preserve appearances, but because you choose it, because you want the life we could build together." I looked at him. This man who had endured so much and remained kind, who had turned the Duke's weapon against him with nothing but courage and cleverness, who had never stopped loving me through all the darkness. "Yes," I said, and laughed because it felt like the easiest answer I had ever given. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I choose you. I have always chosen you." We were married quietly 2 months later, in a small church in Bloomsbury, with Lord Grayson standing as witness and a handful of friends in attendance. My mother came, though I think it pained her to see me marry so far beneath what she had hoped for me. But she kissed my cheek afterward and whispered that she supposed love was worth something after all, and I knew we would find our way back to each other eventually. Thomas and I took a small house in an unfashionable neighborhood, 3 rooms that we furnished with cast-offs and economical purchases. I continued writing for the Times, my articles gradually building a modest reputation. Thomas's work with electrical systems expanded, and he began to receive offers from companies across England who wanted his expertise. We were not wealthy, would probably never be wealthy, but we had enough, and we had each other. Sometimes, in the evenings, we would sit together in our parlor, and Thomas would tell me about the new electrical developments he was studying, safer systems that could never be perverted the way the Duke had used them. And I would tell him about the letters I received from women who had read my articles and found courage to make their own difficult choices. We spoke often about how close we had come to losing everything, how easily the Duke's plan might have succeeded if Thomas had not been clever enough and brave enough to turn the lights themselves into weapons of truth. A year after the trial, we heard that the Duke had died in prison. The official cause was heart failure, but the newspapers speculated about suicide or violence from other prisoners who had learned what he had done. I felt nothing when I read the news, no satisfaction or grief, only a vague relief that he could hurt no one else. Thomas was quiet that evening, and I knew he was thinking of the other victims, the ones who had not survived, the ones whose names we would never know. We visited the Duke's former estate once, in late autumn, when the leaves were turning and the air smelled of smoke and decay. The house stood empty now, windows dark, the grounds overgrown. The government had seized it, but no one wanted to buy such a place, tainted as it was by what had happened there. We walked through the gardens where Thomas had been held prisoner, past the wing where the laboratory had been located, and stood together looking up at the house where the midnight ball had been held. "Do you regret any of it?" Thomas asked quietly. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you still choose this path?" I thought about the question carefully. I thought about the girl I had been, numb with grief and ready to accept a loveless marriage for my family's sake. I thought about the terror of that night when the lamps had spelled out their impossible message and everything I believed had shattered. I thought about the scandal and struggle and all the ways my life had become smaller in society's eyes and larger in my own. "No," I said finally. "I would not change it. I would not choose safety over truth or comfort over love or silence over the courage to speak. What we did mattered, Thomas. We stopped a monster, we gave his victims justice, and we found our way back to each other. That is worth everything it cost." He pulled me close, and we stood together in the fading light, two people who had been broken and remade, who had learned that electricity could illuminate or torture depending on who wielded it, that science without conscience was monstrosity, and that love, real love, was worth fighting for even when the whole world seemed arrayed against it. As we walked back toward the road where our hired carriage waited, I looked back one last time at that dark house. No lights showed in its windows now. The brilliant electric lamps that had been the Duke's pride and our salvation had been removed, sold, or destroyed. The house was just stone and wood now, empty and powerless, slowly being reclaimed by weather and neglect. And I thought that was fitting somehow. The Duke had believed his wealth and technology made him untouchable, but in the end, he had been brought down by the very systems he trusted, exposed by the light he thought he controlled. We never returned to that place again. There was no need. The past was behind us, its lessons learned, its wounds slowly healing. We built our life together in London, modest and happy, surrounded by friends who valued character over pedigree and work that felt meaningful. I continued writing, eventually publishing a book about women's rights and the need for legal protections against abuse of power. Thomas became one of the foremost experts on electrical safety, developing standards that would prevent future misuse of the technology. We never became wealthy or fashionable, but we became content, which was a far rarer and more precious thing. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the lamps glowed softly in our parlor, Thomas would take my hand, and I would remember that terrible night when the lights had spelled out his name and I had learned he was alive. I would remember the courage it had taken to fight back, the terror and hope mingled together, the moment when I had realized I could choose truth over safety and love over duty. Those lamps had told me secrets in their flickering language, had revealed horrors and offered hope, had shown me both the worst and best that human beings were capable of. But now they were just lights, nothing more. They illuminated our home, our work, our life together. And that, I thought as Thomas smiled at me across the room, was magic enough. We had survived the Duke's midnight ball, had turned his weapon of control into an instrument of justice, and had found our way to a happiness built not on wealth or status, but on choice and courage and love. The lamps no longer spelled out messages or revealed hidden truths. They simply glowed, steady and warm, lighting the way forward into a future we had fought for and earned and would spend the rest of our lives grateful to share.